"Get off my aircraft. Now. Before I have you arrested for trespassing on federal property." Those 9 words came out of Captain Grant Sullivan's mouth at 8:47 in the morning on a stretch of private tarmac in Charlotte, North Carolina, aimed at a man in a charcoal wool overcoat who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't touched anything he shouldn't have, and hadn't done a single thing wrong, except walk up a set of air stairs while being exactly who he was. Rewind 40 minutes, and none of this had happened yet. The morning was cold enough that breath hung in the air over Charlotte Douglas International's private aviation ramp, where a Bombardier Global 7500 sat gleaming under sodium floodlights, tail number N418RW, worth just north of $75 million. Frost still clung to the leading edge of the wings. A ground crew technician in an orange vest was running a de-icing check, clipboard in hand, breath fogging the cold air in short bursts. Inside the cabin, the scent of fresh brewed Ethiopian coffee mixed with new leather and the faint bite of aviation cleaner. Everything about this airplane said money that didn't need to announce itself. This part of the story is about a compass. Not a real one, a small tarnished brass pin, no bigger than a quarter, shaped like a compass rose, with a single scratch across its glass face. Keep your eye on it. It matters more than the $75 million jet ever will. Marcus Whitfield had pinned that compass to the inside of his coat lapel that morning, the way he did every single flight, out of habit older than his marriage. It had belonged to his father, Elroy Whitfield, a man who spent 31 years driving long-haul freight up and down I-85 and never once got to set foot inside an airport terminal as anything other than someone dropping a package at the cargo dock. Elroy used to say that the compass didn't point north. It pointed toward wherever your dignity was, and your job in life was to keep walking in that direction, no matter who tried to spin you around. Marcus was 44 years old, 6'1", built lean from a decade of early morning rowing on Lake Norman, and dressed that day in a plain gray overcoat with no visible logos, dark jeans, and a pair of scuffed brown boots that had seen better winters. Nothing about him said, founder and majority owner of Ridgeline Capital Partners, a private equity firm that, 11 days earlier, had closed a $340 million acquisition of Sterling Aviation Group, the very charter operator whose airplane he was about to board. He hadn't told anyone at Sterling who he was. Not the dispatcher, not the ground crew, not the flight attendant who'd checked the manifest that morning. He'd asked his assistant to book the flight under his legal name, no title, no company letterhead, the same way any client would book a $41,000 round trip to Aspen. His reason was simple, and he'd said it to his wife, Renee, over coffee 3 days earlier. "I want to know what my company actually is before I let it use my name." Renee Whitfield walked beside him across the tarmac that morning in a camel wool coat, her dark hair pulled back, carrying nothing but a leather tote and the quiet, settled confidence of a woman who had spent 19 years building a pediatric occupational therapy practice from a single rented office into 4 clinics across Mecklenburg County. She didn't need anyone's permission to belong anywhere, and it showed in the unhurried way she walked, like the tarmac itself had been waiting for her. Their son Elijah, 17, trailed a half step behind them, backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing a faded NASA hoodie and carrying, of all things, a dog-eared paperback on turbine engine design that he'd been reading on the drive to the airport. Elijah wanted to study aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech. He'd built a working-scale model of a jet engine for his senior science fair the year before, using scavenged bicycle parts and a 3D printer he'd saved up for himself, working weekends at a hardware store to afford it. He was the kind of 17-year-old who got quietly, completely absorbed by machines, the way some kids get absorbed by music or basketball. None of that mattered to what was waiting for them at the top of the air stairs. Captain Grant Sullivan was 58 years old, and he had flown for 26 of those years, the last 9 of them in private aviation after what he described to anyone who'd listen as leaving the airlines, because he was tired of being told how to do his job by people who'd never sat in a cockpit. He stood 5'11" with a square jaw, a silver crew cut, and the kind of posture that made junior crew members straighten their own spines just being near him. 4 gold stripes sat on each epaulette. He wore them like a crown. Sullivan liked private aviation for exactly one reason: control. On an airliner, he was one voice among a hierarchy. On a private jet, he was the last word. It had. Federal Aviation Regulation Part 91 gave him final authority over who flew and who didn't, and over the years he had come to treat that authority less like a responsibility and more like a personal kingdom, one where he alone decided who looked like they belonged in $75 million leather seats. In the galley, flight attendant Nina Castillo, 29, was polishing champagne flutes and double-checking the temperature on a tray of chilled Perrier Jouet. She'd flown 11 trips with Sullivan in the past 4 months, and she'd learned to read the tightening of his jaw the way sailors read a change in wind. Something about this manifest had already put him on edge before the passengers had even arrived, and Nina couldn't say why. Only that she felt it the way you feel a storm coming before the sky changes color. Whitfield, Marcus Sullivan read off the tablet, scrolling through the day's manifest with one eyebrow raised. Whitfield, Renee. Whitfield, Elijah. Booked through Ridgeline Capital. No corporate account on file. First-time charter. He looked up, out through the cockpit windscreen, scanning the tarmac for a car. Ridgeline Capital, he muttered to his first officer, a quieter man named Douglas Feeney, who mostly kept his eyes on his checklist. Never heard of them. Probably some new money outfit trying to look bigger than it is. At 8:31, a black Suburban rolled to a stop at the base of the airstairs, and the Whitfield family stepped out into the cold. Sullivan watched them from the cockpit window, the way a hawk watches movement in tall grass. He watched Marcus straighten his coat. He watched Renee adjust her son's backpack strap without being asked. He watched Elijah look up at the tailfin with open, unguarded wonder. And in the 3 seconds it took to watch all of that, Sullivan had already decided who they were, and he was wrong. He unbuckled his harness before the family had even reached the top step. That's the first tier. Watch it happen, because it will happen twice more, worse each time. Elijah reached the cabin door first, and rather than sitting, he leaned, just leaned, hands in his own pockets, not a finger extended toward anything, to look through the open cockpit doorway at the glowing Honeywell Primus Epic displays. "Is that dual FMS redundancy?" he asked quietly. Mostly to himself, the way a kid asks a question he already half knows the answer to because he just wants to hear it confirmed. Sullivan spun in his seat like the boy had reached for a weapon. "Get back," Sullivan snapped, his voice cracking through the cabin like a dropped tray of glass. "Hands where I can see them. This is a secured flight deck, not a museum exhibit for you to gawk at." Elijah froze mid-step, his mouth still open around the question he hadn't finished asking. Nina, in the galley, felt her stomach drop through the floor of the aircraft. "Sorry," Elijah said, taking a full step back, his voice smaller than it had been 30 seconds earlier. "I wasn't going to touch." "I don't care what you were going to do," Sullivan barked, unbuckling fully now and rising to his full height in the narrow galley space, looming over a 17-year-old boy. The way a man looms over someone he has already decided doesn't deserve an ounce of patience. "Sit down, now." This is where the air in the cabin changed. Nina would describe it later to someone who asked, as the moment, the champagne flute in her hand went from cool to freezing, though she knew that wasn't physically true. It was just how the silence felt. Marcus, who had been sliding his overcoat off his shoulders, stopped moving entirely. He didn't speak yet. He simply walked unhurried, 3 steps forward, and placed himself in the narrow space between his son and the captain. Not aggressively, not even quickly, just completely, the way a door closes. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked. His voice was level, not cold, not warm. Level the way a surgeon's voice is level before an incision. Sullivan looked him up and down, and here's just a second tier worse than the first. Because now it wasn't about a boy standing too close to a doorway. Now it was aimed directly at a grown man who had done nothing but ask a calm question. "The problem, sir," Sullivan said, drawing the word sir out like an insult wrapped in courtesy, "is that I don't recognize your names on this manifest, and I don't recognize your faces from any client file I've flown before, and frankly, given some recent issues we've had with broker fraud in this industry, I need to see identification for all 3 of you before this aircraft moves another inch." Renee, who had just taken her seat in a cream leather club chair, looked up sharply. "The FBO already checked our IDs at the security gate," she said. "That's standard. This is a second check that no other charter I've flown has ever required." "That's ground security," Sullivan said, inventing the distinction on the spot, the same way a man invents a rule after he's already decided the outcome he wants. "I'm flight security, and right now, I am not comfortable with 3 unfamiliar passengers who booked under a company I've never heard of, one of whom was just reaching toward my avionics." "He wasn't reaching toward anything," Marcus said. Still level, still calm, though something behind his eyes had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man doing math instead of feeling. "My son asked a question about the flight management system. That's the whole of what happened." Sullivan's jaw worked side to side. He hated being corrected in front of his own flight attendant. Hated it with a heat that had nothing to do with the cold tarmac outside, and everything to do with 26 years of believing that 4 gold stripes meant nobody got to speak to him like that. Somewhere in the part of his mind he never examined too closely, a old ugly arithmetic was running. Young black man too close to the cockpit, older black man defending him instead of apologizing, and a company name that didn't ring any bells. The sum of which, in Sullivan's head, added up to something other than what was actually standing in front of him. It added up to threat. "I am the pilot in command," Sullivan said, his voice climbing. "This aircraft does not move until I'm satisfied. Now, identification, all 3. This isn't a discussion." Marcus reached into his coat, unhurried, and produced his North Carolina driver's license. Renee handed over her passport and Elijah's. Sullivan snatched them, not took, and held each one up to the cabin light like he expected to find a forgery, comparing photographs to faces with theatrical, insulting slowness, the kind of scrutiny designed less to verify anything, and more to make the people in front of him feel small. "The names check out," Sullivan finally said, handing them back without meeting anyone's eyes. "But you'll excuse me if I find it strange that Ridgeline Capital doesn't have you listed as an executive on any account I can find. What exactly is your relationship to the company?" "That is not information I'm required to give you," Marcus said, his voice still even, still quiet, but with something new underneath it now, something with an edge. "Our names are on the manifest. This flight is paid in full. Your responsibility is to fly us to Aspen safely. I'd suggest you focus on that." It was the tone that broke something loose in Sullivan. Not the words, the tone. The unhurried, unbothered authority of a man who had never once, in his entire life, needed Grant Sullivan's approval for anything, and who clearly wasn't about to start needing it now. "Listen to me," Sullivan said, "and here comes the 3rd tier, the one with teeth, the one you don't walk back from. I don't know who you think you are, or how you scraped together the money for a flight like this, but you don't get to talk to me like I work for you. I am responsible for a $75 million aircraft and everyone on it. If I do determine that a passenger is uncooperative, or poses any kind of risk to this flight, I am fully within my rights, under Part 91, to deny boarding. Effective immediately, that's what I'm doing. He didn't yell at our son, Renee said, standing now, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. He asked you to stop yelling at our son. The only person creating a disturbance on this aircraft, Captain, is you. Don't raise your voice at me, Sullivan snapped, pointing a finger toward her. And something about that gesture, the finger, jabbing toward his wife, did something to Marcus's face that Nina would remember for the rest of her career. Not anger. Something colder and more final than anger. Do not point at my wife, Mark said. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and the whole cabin seemed to hold its breath around those 6 words. The APU hum faded into background static. Nobody moved. This is the first frozen moment of the story, the one where nothing happens for 3 full seconds, and everything changes anyway. Sullivan mistook the stillness for weakness, the way men like Sullivan always do. He straightened his shoulders, savoring what he believed was a victory already won. That's it, he announced, turning toward Nina, who was standing rigid against the galley bulkhead, eyes wide, one hand pressed flat against her own sternum like she could hold her heart in place. Open the door. Get the stairs back up. This family is off my aircraft. Captain, please, Nina said, her voice cracking. They haven't done anything. Dispatch cleared this manifest. I said, open door. Sullivan roared, and Nina flinched like she'd been struck, reaching with trembling fingers for the hydraulic release. The door hissed open. Cold air flooded back into the cabin. Out on the tarmac, a bewildered ground crew technician wheeled the air stairs back into place, unsure why a flight that hadn't even started engines was suddenly aborting. Marcus looked at Sullivan for a long moment. Are you certain, Captain? He said quietly. This is your last opportunity to reconsider. I have never been more certain of anything, Sullivan said, arms crossed over his chest like a man guarding a castle. Off, now. Or I call airport police and have all 3 of you removed in handcuffs for interference with a flight crew. Marcus turned to his son. Elijah's jaw was tight, his eyes bright with a fury he was working very hard to keep contained. Grab your bag, Ty, Marcus said gently, using the nickname only family used. We're leaving. Dad, we're just going to let him. Elijah started. We're not letting him do anything, son, Marcus said, resting a hand on his shoulder as they gathered their things. We're letting him finish building the trap he's standing in. As they passed the galley, Renee paused and looked at Nina, whose eyes were rimmed red, one silent tear tracking down her cheek. This isn't on you, sweetheart, Renee said softly. You tried, that matters more than you know. Sullivan stood in the open cabin doorway, watching the family descend the air stairs into the cold, and he felt something he would later, much later, be ashamed to admit he'd felt: satisfaction. The particular, poisonous satisfaction of a man who believes he has just successfully defended something that was never his to defend in the first place. Get their bags out of the hold, he barked down to the ground crew. Then he turned back to Nina. Stop crying and get this cabin reset. I'm calling dispatch. Tell them we may be short 3 seats, or the broker's sending the real clients. He marched back into the cockpit and dropped into his seat like a king, reclaiming a throne. He had no idea, in that moment, that the throne belonged to someone else entirely, and that the someone else was standing on the freezing tarmac 40 feet away, pulling out his phone. Down below, Renee adjusted her sunglasses against the sharp winter light. Well, she said, her voice dry as sand, that was certainly an education. He profiled us, Elijah said, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He heard me ask one question and decided I was a threat. He heard Dad correct him and decided we were criminals. He just assumed. I know, son, Marcus said, and his voice had lost its courtroom calm now, replaced by something warmer and sadder underneath. Some people will look at you and build an entire story about your worth before you've said a single word. The only thing you control is whether you let them make you shout back. Loud doesn't win this. It never has. He scrolled past his recent calls to a number saved simply as W. Briggs. Sterling. The line picked up on the second ring. It had. "Marcus, good morning," boomed the voice of Walter Briggs, chief executive of Sterling Aviation Group. The man Ridgeline had kept on to run day-to-day operations after the acquisition closed 11 days earlier. "You should be somewhere over Tennessee by now. How's the 7500 treating you?" Marcus watched the suburban driver, confused, already circling back toward them, radioed by a ground crew supervisor who didn't understand why bags were coming back off a plane that hadn't left the gate. "We're not in the air, Walter," Marcus said, his voice conversational, almost light. The calm before a very specific kind of storm. "We're standing on the tarmac. Your captain just removed my wife, my son, and me from the aircraft." Silence. A long, heavy silence, the kind that has weight, the kind you can hear a man's stomach drop into. "He did. What?" "He decided we didn't belong," Marcus said. "He demanded identification after our names matched the manifest. He screamed at my 17-year-old son for standing near an open cockpit door and asking a question about avionics. He pointed his finger at my wife. And then he threw all three of us off a plane that, as of 11 days ago, my firm owns outright." Walter Briggs made a sound like a man who had just been told his house was on fire while he was standing inside it. "Marcus." I don't have words. I will fire him within the hour." "Not yet," Marcus said, and something in his voice made Walter go quiet immediately. "I have a better idea. Call dispatch. Tell Captain Sullivan that the actual owner of Sterling Aviation was delayed in morning traffic and is now 10 minutes out, and that the owner has personally requested Sullivan meet him on the tarmac for an inspection before that aircraft is cleared for any further flights today." There was a pause, and then, slowly, understanding dawned in Walter's voice. "You want him to wait for you. I want him to sweat a little first," Marcus said. "Let him rehearse his best smile for a boss he thinks is a stranger. Then I'm going to walk back up those stairs and let him meet the man he already threw away." 20 minutes. That's how long Grant Sullivan stood at the base of the air stairs in a stiff parade rest, his breath fogging in the January cold, his uniform jacket buttoned to the throat, his shoes going numb against frostbitten concrete. He kept checking his reflection in the polished cowling of the aircraft's engine, straightening the same crease in his collar 4 separate times. He imagined a Rolls-Royce, or maybe a Bentley Flying Spur. He imagined a silver-haired titan of industry stepping out, someone who would shake his hand and thank him personally for protecting the asset from suspicious walk-ons. What rolled up instead, at 9:41, was a black Suburban he recognized immediately, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The rear door opened. Marcus Whitfield stepped out. Same gray overcoat, same unhurried gait, the small brass compass pin catching a flash of winter sunlight on his lapel. Behind him came Renee, then Elijah, arms crossed, jaw set, watching Sullivan with the flat, expectant stare of a boy who already knew exactly how this was going to end and was simply waiting for the adult in the situation to catch up. Sullivan's rehearsed, obsequious smile didn't fade. It shattered, all at once, replaced by a violent flush climbing up from his collar. "What in God's name are you doing back here?" Sullivan barked, storming forward, abandoning every last shred of the composure he'd spent 20 minutes freezing to maintain. "I told you, you are banned from this ramp. This is a secured federal facility. I am calling the police right now." Marcus didn't flinch, didn't raise a hand, didn't do anything except stand perfectly still and let Sullivan close the distance between them until the captain was close enough that Marcus could see the sweat beading on his temple despite the cold. "You people," Sullivan spat, reaching for the radio clipped to his belt, have absolutely no respect for how the real world works. You are going to be arrested. I am going to press charges personally for interference with a flight crew, and I am going to make sure every charter operator on the East Coast knows your names." Marcus let him finish. He always let them finish. His father had taught him that, decades ago, standing beside a loading dock where men in short-sleeve shirts used to talk to Elroy Whitfield the exact same way. "Let a man dig his hole all the way down," his father used to say. "Never hand him the shovel back." "Are you finished, Captain?" Marcus asked, once Sullivan had run dry, his chest heaving under his jacket. "I am finished with you," Sullivan snarled. "The owner of this company is arriving any minute, and I am not going to let a bunch of fraudulent walk-ons ruin this inspection. Turn around, walk away." Now, Marcus reached into his coat, not for the wallet this time. He drew out a phone, screen already lit, a call already live on speaker. "Walter," Marcus said calmly. "Still there?" "Right here, Mr. Whitfield," came Walter Briggs's voice, tinny but clear across the open tarmac. "I've heard the last 2 minutes of that. All of it." Sullivan's hand froze over his radio. The blood left his face so fast he swayed slightly on his feet, like the ground itself had shifted underneath him. "Mr. Whitfield," Sullivan said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "What is this, Rick?" Walter said, and his voice had gone somewhere. Sullivan had never heard it go before, flat and formal and final. "The man standing in front of you is Marcus Whitfield, founder and managing partner of Ridgeline Capital Partners." 11 days ago, Ridgeline completed a full acquisition of Sterling Aviation Group. Every aircraft in this fleet, every hangar, every employment contract, including yours, now belongs to him. The silence that followed was heavier than the winter air. It pressed down on the tarmac like a held breath. Sullivan stared at Marcus, really looked at him, for the first time all morning, and saw finally what had been standing in front of him the entire time. Not a walk-on, not a fraud, not a threat. His employer, the man whose company he had spent the last hour humiliating over a compass pin, an overcoat with no logo, and the color of his skin. "No," Sullivan said, stumbling half a step backward. That's not dispatch would have told me. The manifest didn't say." "The manifest," said Whitfield. "Marcus?" Marcus said quietly, slipping the phone back into his pocket, the call still live. "You didn't need a title to know how to treat a family standing in front of you. You decided we didn't belong before we said a single word. You decided that because of what you saw, not what you knew. That's not a mistake, Captain. That's a pattern. And I intend to find out exactly how long it's been running." "I was following protocol," Sullivan stammered, hands raised now in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Broker fraud is a real problem in this industry. I was protecting the aircraft. I was protecting your assets, sir." "You weren't protecting anything," Marcus said. And now, finally, something sharp entered his voice, a blade drawn slow enough that you almost didn't see it coming. "You were protecting your own ego. I bought this company because my father spent 31 years hauling freight up I-85 and never once got to walk through a terminal like a person who mattered. I wanted his grandson to sit in a cockpit seat someday and know that nobody gets to decide he doesn't belong there. I flew today without announcing who I was, because I wanted to see how Sterling treats people who can't prove, on command, that they deserve respect. And what I found, Captain Sullivan, was a man who screamed at a 17-year-old for loving airplanes, who pointed his finger at my wife, and who has apparently made a career out of deciding on site who counts as a real client and who doesn't." "Please," Sullivan said, and the tears came now, hot and humiliated, cutting tracks down a face gone gray with panic. "Please, Mr. Whitfield. 30 years in the air, a flawless safety record. I'll fly you to Aspen myself, right now, the smoothest flight of your life. I am so sorry. I misjudged the situation." "I accept that you're sorry you got caught," Marcus said. "Walter, still there?" Still here, Mr. Whitfield. Before you terminate him, Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Sullivan's face, I want a full review of every denied boarding incident this man has logged in the last 5 years. Every one. I have a strong suspicion this isn't the first family he's decided didn't belong on one of our aircraft. There was a pause on the line, and then Walter's voice came back, quieter, grimmer than before. Mr. Whitfield, I pulled it up while you were talking. There are 4 prior incidents flagged in his file over the last 3 years. All 4 were closed as customer misunderstandings. All 4 involved passengers of color. Elijah's fists uncurled slowly at his sides, not in relief, but in something closer to grief. The specific grief of a 17-year-old realizing, for the first time in a very concrete way, that what happened to him that morning wasn't an accident, it was a habit. Sullivan's mouth opened and closed twice. No sound coming out, the last of his fight finally, completely draining out of him. Captain Richard Grant Sullivan, Marcus said, his voice carrying clean across the frozen tarmac, is terminated, effective immediately. Revoke his ramp access. Notify the FBO he's no longer authorized on Sterling's account anywhere in this country. And Walter, I want those 4 families found. I want to know their names. And I want to know what an apology from this company actually looks like. Sullivan dropped to his knees on the frost-slicked concrete, the cold seeping through his uniform trousers, his hands pressed flat against his own thighs like he was trying to hold himself together by force. You can't do this, he said, though even he seemed to hear how hollow it sounded now. It's already done, Marcus said. He felt no triumph in it, only the tired, necessary weight of removing something that never should have been allowed to run loose this long. Get up, Captain. You still have some dignity left. Use it to walk to that police car on your own feet. 2 Charlotte-Mecklenburg Airport police cruisers were already rolling across the tarmac, light bars turning silent rhythmic red and blue against the pale morning sky. Called ahead by Walter Briggs the moment the line had gone quiet, not to arrest the Whitfields, but to escort a newly terminated employee off secured private property. Sullivan watched them come the way a man watches weather he can no longer outrun. Slowly, his hands shaking, he reached up and unpinned the 4 gold stripes from each shoulder. The symbols of an authority he had spent decades treating like a birthright instead of a responsibility, and handed them to the ground crew supervisor who'd jogged over to assist. Then he stood and let the officers walk him to the back of a cruiser and did not look back at the aircraft even once. He really thought he owned that plane, Elijah murmured, watching the cruiser shrink into the distance. Men like that always do, Marcus said, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. They build their whole identity out of deciding who's beneath them, because somewhere underneath all that, they're terrified of a world where none of that matters. Where what actually decides your worth is how you treat someone with nothing to prove and everything to lose. 25 minutes later, a second captain arrived. A tall man in his early 40s, named Andre Michaels, called in from Sterling's reserve roster, who walked up the air stairs, removed his cap, and gave the family a short, respectful nod before he'd said a single word. Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield. Elijah, it's an honor to have you aboard your own aircraft. I understand what happened this morning, and I promise you the rest of this flight will look nothing like it. The takeoff, when it finally came, was smooth as poured water. The Global 7500, climbing out over the frost-dusted hills west of Charlotte and banking gently toward the Blue Ridge before turning west. Elijah spent the first hour of the flight standing quietly just behind the flight deck door, at Captain Michael's open invitation, asking careful, precise questions about fly-by-wire redundancy and fuel burn curves, and Michaels answered every single one like he had all the time in the world, because that morning, he did. Later, back in his seat, Elijah turned to his father. When he first started yelling at me Elijah said. I wanted to tell him exactly who you were. I wanted to throw it in his face and watch him panic. Why didn't you? Marcus asked. Though he already knew the answer, the way fathers sometimes ask questions, they already know the answer to, just to hear their child say it out loud. Because then I'd have been playing his game, Elijah said, looking out at the curve of the earth visible from 41,000 feet. He wanted us to react like the story he already had in his head. You didn't give him that. You just let him keep talking until the truth did the work for you. That's the whole of it, son, Marcus said, and something in his chest loosened, the particular relief of watching a lesson land somewhere it would actually stay. Money is a tool. It's not proof of anything, and it's not a weapon you swing to make people sorry. The only thing that ever actually humbles a man like that is watching his own certainty collapse under its own weight. We didn't do that to him. He built it, brick by brick, all by himself. 6 months later, on a bright morning in July, a different family walked up a different set of air stairs at Charlotte Douglas. A Sterling client this time. A retired schoolteacher named Odessa Marsh, flying to see her granddaughter graduate from the Air Force Academy, traveling on a complimentary charter. Sterling now offered once a quarter to families identified through a new community partnership Renee Whitfield had personally helped design. At the top of the stairs stood Nina Castillo, promoted eventually to lead cabin director for Sterling's entire Charlotte base, who greeted Mrs. Marsh by name before she'd even reached the cabin door, because Nina had learned in the worst possible classroom exactly what it looked like when someone got that greeting wrong. Inside the terminal, that same morning, a laminated card sat mounted near the crew briefing room. Small enough that those passengers never noticed it. It read simply, "Every name on this manifest belongs here, no exceptions, no assumptions." And clipped beside it, in a small shadowbox frame that Marcus had donated himself, sat a tarnished brass compass pin with a single scratch across its glass face. Not explained, not labeled, just there, pointing the same worn direction it always had. Grant Sullivan never flew commercially again. Word travels fast and merciless in private aviation, and within a month, every major charter operator on the East Coast had heard exactly why Sterling Aviation had let a 26-year captain go without severance. He'd traded his wings for his own certainty, and the sky, in the end, simply stopped making room for him. If this story found something true in you, not the ending, but the moment you recognized someone you've met, or someone you've been hit like, so it can find the next person who needs the reminder that dignity isn't something you have to prove on command. Share it with someone who's ever had to hand over their ID just to be believed. And tell me in the comments, have you ever stood in that cabin? And if you had, which person would you have been?